Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I would also like to pay my respect to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous peoples who may be present today. So, polemic. I love my country. I have lived here all my life, and I have a deep and passionate relationship with the land and its people. But like a lot of relationships, this one is complicated. It is marred by bouts of disappointment and rage and frustration. I find that I cannot love my country in an uncomplicated way because there are some fundamental injustices that get in the way. And there are problems that we seem unable to resolve despite our best efforts. In my recently published book that Michael referred to, Beyond White Guilt, I argue that key amongst these problems is our guilt, our collective national guilt about the past. And today I want to tell you why I think this is so. White Australia was settled on land that did not belong to us. Deep in our hearts, every Australian knows this to be true. Australia was not conquered through war, nor were treaties signed with the original inhabitants. Rather, the British, who arrived in 1788, advanced a brutal program of violent dispossession that spread from Sydney Cove to all corners of the continent, eventually inflicting trauma upon every single Indigenous man, woman and child with devastating effect. We know this. Murray Goot and Tim Rouse have noted the evidence from public opinion polling that shows that most Australians admit that it is accurate to observe that colonisation treated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples very badly. We know of the wrongs of our past, the obscenity, atrocity and injustice upon which our nation was constructed, and yet we are stuck. For many of us today, this knowledge about our past is a source of guilt. Some of us turn this guilt inwards, leaving us paralysed and helpless to address the contemporary manifestations of our history. Indeed, I think some people carry that guilt as a flag-waving badge of honour to say, "Look how guilty I feel, I can't do anything." Others turn this guilt outwards, expressing anger at the country's original inhabitants for their failure to grasp what they see as the opportunities that colonisation has brought. As a nation, however, we have failed to deal with the collective and intergenerational nature of our guilt. Since colonisation, the dominant response to the original inhabitants of this country has ranged from hostility to fear, and from curiosity to ambivalence, tempered at times by compassion and eventually governed by frustration. Governments have reflected these changes in public sentiment through policy that has in turn sought to obliterate or assimilate Australia's Indigenous peoples. Almost without exception, efforts to talk about the wrongs of our past and our guilt in the present have been shot down as not being in the national interest. Why? Why do we remain so stuck in this unhealthy, unhappy relationship? Research undertaken by Reconciliation Australia in their Reconciliation Barometer tells us that we want to change. 87% of non-Indigenous Australians agree that the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia is important. But 93% of Indigenous people and 73% of the rest of us believe that we are prejudiced against each other. And only 12% of Indigenous people and 9% of the rest of us believe that we trust each other. This relationship is not in good shape. We have, of course, made efforts in the past to improve things. The 1967 referendum, the Decade of Reconciliation, and the 2008 apology to the stolen generations were all gestures in the right direction. As a nation, we do seem to want to reinscribe for ourselves a moral presence back into the world. but something is in the way. Our sense of guilt about historical and contemporary injustice, whether we acknowledge this guilt or not, damages our ability to relate across cultures, creating unbridgeable divides out of what should be unthreatening cultural differences. But I think one of the messages I want to get across in this book is that all is not lost. Guilt remains a profound and complex barrier to better relationships, but it also presents us with an opportunity. By exploring the ways that we hold collective guilt and shame individually and in the national psyche, we are better equipped to look at the role that these feelings play in our refusal to address our history genuinely, and to understand how personal and collective guilt blocks us from moving forward. I accept that guilt is a difficult concept to apply in the Australian context, and I have no doubt that there are some in the community who will simply roll their eyes at my arguments, convinced that it either does not apply to them as individuals or that it should not be applied to Australia as a whole. Confronting information about unjust or immoral acts committed by members of our own social group is highly unpleasant, and it poses a kind of threat to our social and national identity. This experience is all the more difficult for those known as high identifiers, who place a significant value on their group identity, who are strongly motivated to protect and enhance that identity, even if it means denying the truth. We saw those high identifiers out in force during the history wars. But efforts to deny or to avoid our guilt do not erase its existence. Denying guilt is not the same as not experiencing guilt in the first place. But my positive message is that guilt does offer some potential as a driver of transformative change. Arguments for social change based in claims for justice, which is certainly the types of claims I've tried to advance over many years now, are often simply not enough to motivate people to work to change a system or a society in which they continue to be privileged and to experience benefit. Guilt is a more personal experience. It is a constant reminder that all is not right. Guilt signals that a relationship with an individual or a group is damaged, and that action should be taken to repair that damage. Guilt is often accompanied by a motivation to apologise for doing harm in order to repair that damaged relationship. Guilt tells us that whatever we have done in the past is not enough, that there is more to be done to create a just and fair society. Guilt brings with it a need for forgiveness and approbation, and can therefore help us to move from sentimentality to political action. Accepting collective guilt and using it to focus our attention on redress and restitution can be a powerful political tool. So now I'd like to introduce you to a framework that I have found very useful in thinking through some of these difficult issues. My exploration of our collective guilt is, in part, an attempt to diagnose what the Harvard professor Ronald Heifetz would call an adaptive challenge. And having undertaken that diagnosis, to propose some of the adaptive work that we as a nation have to do. Heifetz describes adaptive challenges as involving those problems for which there are no simple or painless solutions, problems that require us to learn new ways. Problems, in other words, that require us to adapt, to develop our social and cultural capacity. Adaptive work consists of the learning required to address conflicts in the values that people hold, or to diminish the gap between the values people stand for and the reality they face. So in Australia, our land of a fair go, how do we accommodate that gap between the way in which we value equality and the lived experiences of many Indigenous peoples? Adaptive work requires a change in values, beliefs or behaviour. The exposure and often the orchestration of conflict, our internal contradictions within individuals and constituencies, provide the leverage for mobilising people to learn new ways. What Heifetz is suggesting is that for progress to be made in complex situations where many of the previous technical solutions have persistently failed, change is required at a deeper level. In the Australian context, I'm suggesting that we are not talking about a change of policy or even a change of government. If we want to close the gap between the values many of us profess to hold with regard to the status and life chances of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the reality that we face, what needs to change is us. No matter how much effort we direct at the institutional political realm, a change of government or minister or policy, much as I sometimes long for some or all of those things, will never be enough to address the challenges that we face. Adaptive problems can create considerable stress and a sense of urgency among some groups in society. Our first response in the face of such stress tends to be to look to authority and to demand that they make a difference. Heifetz describes this inclination as generating what he calls inappropriate dependencies. Our dependency on authority to create change is inappropriate because time and again, when the accepted dependencies are applied to problems that cause persistent distress, they reveal that they cannot do the job. The response from authorities such as governments to this kind of pressure will often make the situation worse, or at least it will perpetuate the problem. Authorities are often under pressure to appear decisive, and as a result they are inclined to fake the remedy or take action that avoids the issue by skirting it altogether. Authorities are always more likely to deal with an adaptive challenge by diverting attention from the issue. By applying a technical solution rather than engaging in adaptive work, the problem then appears to be taken care of. The public response, our response, when authority fails or when the problem in fact worsens in response to the supposed solution, is to perpetuate this vicious cycle by looking even more earnestly to authority for a new solution, often switching our support to someone new who promises new and better answers. Although Heifetz in his writings is talking generically of the challenges of adaptive leadership and adaptive change, the scenario that he describes that I've just relayed to you is, I think, an alarmingly accurate description of the cycle of Indigenous policy in Australia. In response to the public distress about the so-called Aboriginal problem, over decades and decades, government have applied various fake remedies: protection, assimilation, and most recently, intervention. And governments continue to apply these fake remedies because we let them. Our distress in the face of persistent Indigenous disadvantage and our underlying collective guilt about its causes leads us to engage in what Heifetz calls work avoidance. It is easier for us to let authorities skirt the issue with fake remedies than it is for us to engage in our own adaptive work. This flight to authority is dangerous, not only because it occurs in response to such a complex and difficult challenge, but also because it immobilises some of our very best personal and collective resources for doing the work that really needs to be done. Key to the problem of work avoidance is our tendency to want to avoid feelings of distress and discomfort, such as feelings of guilt. But in taking the first steps in our adaptive challenge, that is, in beginning to diagnose what the problem really is, these unpleasant feelings can in fact form an important diagnostic principle. Heifetz suggests that if social distress cannot be alleviated through the application of our technical know-how or our known policies and procedures, then the feelings themselves provide an important clue to what the adaptive challenge really is. Avoiding our distress will lead us to make comforting misdiagnoses of the problem, allowing certain groups, in this case Indigenous people, to be scapegoated as themselves responsible for the problem. What this misses is that by making any one group in society responsible for a problem, we neglect the fact that social problems in fact involve the whole of society. I have no doubt that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have their own adaptive work to do and will face similar challenges with regard to work avoidance. But their adaptive challenges are not my focus. My concern is with the non-Indigenous adaptive challenge: how to acknowledge our collective guilt and where this acknowledgement might lead us. Adaptive work is not easy. It is painful and difficult. But if we do not do this, if we do not take up this adaptive challenge, it will continue to present us with obstacles. We are deluded if we think there will ever be a government that takes up this challenge without first seeing a profound shift in our social values. Equally, we are deluded if we think that government or government policy is itself the problem. As Heifetz argues, the accumulation of evil never resides in one person at the top, because no one gets to the top without representing the interests of the dominant factions in the system. The evil, if it is evil at all, lives in the routine ways in which people throughout the system collude in maintaining a dysfunctional status quo. Changing the status quo will always require more than simply changing the person of the authority figure. Adaptive work requires adjustments, learning and compromise on the part of many among the dominant, the complacent and the beleaguered. So rather than being complacent about these challenges or avoiding the discomfort that guilt produces, we can choose to act. We can, together, make a commitment to exploring and understanding the dynamics of our collective guilt, and we can use the insight that we gain in that process to develop less damaging, more engaged relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in order that we might coexist more peacefully. In moving those relationships forward, we will find new opportunities to rethink the institutional frameworks of this country, the place of Indigenous peoples in our national polity, the symbols with which we articulate our national identity, and the policies through which we intervene or do not intervene in Indigenous lives. These are enormous tasks, each one, and tasks that we cannot even begin as long as our collective guilt is in the way. I remain convinced that in each of us there is a psychological need to feel good about ourselves, about who we are. The extent to which our sense of who we are is bound to our social or national identity will determine the extent to which we experience collective guilt about the past. A desire to feel good about our group or our nation can lead us to develop explanations and justifications for immoral and unjust actions. For some people, some of the time, and for some people all of the time, these justifications will hold and they will maintain a positive social or national identity. For many other people, however, including me, those justifications will fail at some point. Confronted with historical fact or current day inequality, many people will find themselves unable to sustain their justification for past actions by their group, especially where those actions violate present-day moral standards. The widespread experience of collective guilt is the result. But in acknowledging collective guilt, the task is not just about feeling bad. In fact, acknowledging our collective guilt may actually present us with an opportunity to feel better. We should remember that settler colonies like Australia are highly traumatised societies. Contemporary international discourse on restitution for historical wrongdoings emphasises the important role of guilt, mourning and atonement in national revival and in reconciliation that can transform a traumatic national experience into a constructive political situation. Collective guilt has a vital role to play in developing improved social conditions in the wake of our violent past. Confronting the past and acknowledging our collective guilt may provide us with the impetus for constructing a revitalised national identity and associated social and political institutions. By taking account of past injustice in this work, we may have the opportunity to experience ourselves as truly moral, rather than as defensive and anxious about the past. There is still a cost to non-Indigenous as well as Indigenous people when the privileges of our white society remain based on lies about ourselves and our past. Not only is maintaining these lies exhausting, but we will remain unable to lay claim to our full humanity until we find a way out of this web of denial. If we accept that we are guilty, then we can ask the really difficult questions about sovereignty, about national identity, without constantly having to defend our honour. Acknowledging our collective guilt can be a useful starting point for the hard work that still has to be done. But we must do more than merely regret the past. Regret suggests only that we wish certain events had not happened. A further step is required. In acknowledging and expressing our guilt, we may be able to accept collective responsibility for historical injustice and begin to seriously develop a restorative and decolonising response. I believe that such a response is sorely needed in Australia. What I fear, however, is that until we engage in the adaptive work associated with our collective guilt, we will continue to stumble in this challenge. We will continue to turn to authority and avoid our own work because we want to avoid the distress and discomfort it brings. In doing this, we will continue to hear our historical record defended and our guilt denied, with the argument that a different approach would be divisive of our nation. But our collective guilt is already divisive. It does not hold us together. It drives us apart. Our collective guilt perpetuates inequality. It feeds a defensive and often ugly nationalism, and it starves us of a moral presence in the world. Until we face up to our guilt, we will never be the country we think we are, and my love for this nation will remain deeply complicated. Thank you.